All right, with that, we're recording and let's get into it. Thank you and welcome everyone for coming to this panel discussion about sex and sexual assault for our Sexual Assault Awareness Month 2021. I'm your facilitator, Avani, like how you bake cookies in an oven and they're near me, Avani. I use she, they pronouns and I'm a prevention specialist with a Y. We're here to ask, how can we talk about sexual assault if we can't even talk about sex? We're going to dive deep into what our culture teaches us about sex, about our bodies, and what we need to understand about sex to better understand sexual assault. Again, we want this to be a community discussion along with hearing from our wonderful panelists. So please answer the big questions that we posed in the chat box. We'll also be copy pasting the questions that we ask our panelists in the chat box as well, so you have an idea of what those questions are. If you'd like, we will be reading out a few responses anonymously after we hear from our panelists. Just a reminder that this meeting is recorded, so if you're not comfortable sharing, that's totally fine. We're going to make some time afterwards, after our recording, and we hear from all of our panelists to be able to hear from y'all, be able to share stories, and yeah. If we could now have our panelists introduce themselves, your name, your pronouns, a little bit about your work and your background. Nandini?
Okay. Hi, my name is Nandini Ray, and I'm representing Maitri Bay Area. Maitri is an organization in the Bay Area that supports survivors of domestic violence and the children. 30 years ago, a dedicated small group of women started Maitri by running a crisis helpline at someone's kitchen with a single phone line. And now Maitri is seen as a trusted and culturally responsive agency in the Bay Area in providing a variety of services to survivors of domestic violence. And we not only help them to get out of their crisis and to achieve their safety, stability, and self-sufficiency. Along with crisis intervention, Maitri also engages and educates community members in preventing domestic violence. And I manage Maitri's outreach and prevention program. Thank you.
I can go. Good evening, everybody. My name is Rod Olmeda Lopez, and it's truly an honor to be on a panel with such wonderful people. I am a high school English teacher here in Los Angeles, and I am so I identify as a gay man, and I really want to name, I guess, the points of entry that I'm coming into with this different conversation. So gay man, son of immigrants. My parents are both from Mexico, so there's that part of my identity. And then also have some background in the evangelical world. I wasn't raised evangelical, but I did really engage and was very actively involved in evangelical church in high school and college. So that was very much a formative part of my experience. So wanting to name, those are my entry points. Those are the perspectives that I'm and background that I'm coming in with. But like I said, it's an honor to be with individuals who are really doing the work in the trenches, so to speak, on this topic. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lynn. I am currently a graduate student at the University of Michigan at their public policy school. I'm actually on the East Coast right now. So 9 p.m., here we go, talking about sex on a panel. I used to manage YWCA's crisis intervention team, did a lot of different projects in that team, including working to write the Santa Clara County's first ever sexual assault response protocol. My policy interests are specific to gender-based violence and sexual assault, as well as criminal legal reform. So that's kind of the academic perspectives that I'm coming in from. On a personal note, I'm also a child of immigrants. I'm an immigrant myself. Was born in Vietnam. Okay, I have a lot of fans in the audience. I can see my old coworkers. I came here when I was 6 years old. I was raised as a cisgender heterosexual woman. So that's kind of the perspective I bring into the conversation. And yeah, I'm happy to be here and excited to hear from everybody.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to hear from y'all too and have this discussion. So I'm gonna stop sharing so we get to see our panelists' faces more. And so just to start, from your cultural background, from your upbringing, um, did your families talk about sexual assault? Jumping right into it, right off the bat.
I can talk. Um, should I start? So I'm South Asian. I was born and raised in India, and I came to this country when I was almost 26 years old after I got married. Uh, and when I was growing up, even when I was in college, I had hardly any opportunities to discuss sex or sexuality with my any of my family members, and it is an uncomfortable topic. And it is not only me; many of my friends and peers, especially girls, had the same experience. And things are changing now in South Asian countries due to internet exposures and influence of Western culture. But still, sex and sexuality is a taboo topic in India. Not even in India, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and many other South Asian countries. For most girls, in South Asian countries, sex is something you find out after you get married. Most Indian girls are told that a woman's sexuality and body is first the domain of her family, and after marriage that of her husband, and you don't have much of a say, choice or right to your sexuality. And abstinence is the only way for birth control. So in South Asian culture, it is a common perception that a woman's worth is based on her virginity, chastity, and sexual loyalty after marriage. For boys, community ostracism is not that hard if they are sexually abusive, or sexually active before marriage. Girls, on the other hand, are scared of brutal social ostracism if they get pregnant before marriage. So it's best not to even think or talk about sex before marriage. Forget about having sex. And if you say yes to sex, if you're a girl and if you say yes to sex, then you will be viewed as a slut. And if you are sexually abused, then it will be assumed that it is your fault, you did something to lure your perpetrators. And you must, as a girl, must not dress, walk, sit, or move in any way that tantalizes or titillates men. So when you don't have a clear concept of sex and sexuality, then you don't have a clear concept about sexual abuse. And if you feel that something is bothering you, you are not enjoying any sexual encounter, you don't know that whether you can talk about it or not, whether you can share your feelings with somebody else or not. And there is no one there practically. We are not used to talking about sex with even family members, and forget about outsiders. And there was no formal education when I was growing up in India. I came here about 26, 27 years back, and that time there was no formal sex education in any school. But majority of schools in India, even now, they don't have any formal sex education. And honestly, it's a very gray area. It was a gray area for me and many of my girlfriends at that time, that what is sex, what is sexuality. And in India, especially when I was growing up, more focus was on what we must not do to get pregnant before marriage, or how we should protect ourselves from getting raped. So this kind of topic we were focusing, rather than that, understanding what is healthy sexual relationship, or how to identify one's own sexuality. But now I can openly talk about sex and sexuality with my teen children. Probably it is because of cultural change, it's because of generational gap, because my kids are born and raised here. And And I'm also working in this field is giving me freedom and knowledge to talk about this area. And I'm still seeing many of my South Asian friends, they are extremely uncomfortable discussing sex and sexuality with their children or siblings or any family members. So that proves that individuals, the different individuals from the same community can have different culture, or can have different experience, life experience, and can react to those life experience differently. So a South Asian girl who is born and raised here in this country can have different experience from another South Asian girl who came here when she was, in her early 20s or 30s. So I'm just sharing my experience, also sharing that at large. I mean, I'm not saying that all South Asian women are like that, but mostly it's a very uncomfortable topic, sex and sexuality in South Asian culture.
I feel like, so first of all, thank you for sharing your stories and like what you've experienced in your culture, and sharing a little bit of what you've seen your friends experience. I feel like you touched on so much about gender roles, about the taboo, and kind of all, even going through about how different the experiences are person to person. Um, Gosh, I feel like we could just end there, but so excited to hear more from you, and so excited to hear more from our other panelists. So Rod or Lynn, if you want to talk about whether sexual assault was talked about.
I would love to. It's really great. It's really cool to hear, how I don't know if cool is the right word, but it's interesting to hear the parallels between two cultures that are literally the opposite sides of the planet, right? Talking about Latin America, talking about South Asia. So I'll speak specifically in terms of and I'm speaking in big generalizations here, but of course, but generally in the Latino culture, sex is I mean, many of you are maybe familiar with the term machismo. I'll put it in the chat box so you can, if you're not familiar with it. Machismo, which is essentially Latin American patriarchy. That's kind of what you can roughly translate it as, and it's very much a very real thing. Typically, women, it's similar to in other places. Women are expected to kind of maintain their purity. Virginity is prized and celebrated. And at the same time, on the opposite side of the coin, men are kind of encouraged to be very sexually active and to kind of conquer women. And when you have a very heterosexual heavy society, that creates a very interesting dynamic, right? Where you're encouraging half the population to be sexually active, telling the other half to not be. And so you have these really strong double standards that are present there. So that is very much seen across all of Latin America, and obviously with immigrant populations in the U.S. And I also wanted to share just kind of as I mentioned, I spent some time in the evangelical church, kind of white evangelical church more specifically, and that was interesting because sex is talked about actually quite a bit. I don't know of any other place or community where sex is talked about so much, but it is in a very certain context. The context is we need to all remain virgins until we are married, and we are very, very, very excited for that wedding night. And it's like this like moment that is like kind of put on a pedestal, and everybody's very excited about it. But the idea is there is absolutely no sexual activity of any sort until you are married. And what that creates is kind of a dynamic where sex is talked about in a very specific context, which is after you're married, you can do XYZ. But anything outside of that is not talked about, right? So then you talk about, well, what does safe sex look like? Or what does, obviously not to mention, outside of heterosexual sex look like, right? That's not mentioned at all. And then of course sexual assault isn't really mentioned at all either, because the idea is we're all supposed to wait until we're married, so it's not an issue, right? Not mentioning, obviously marital rape and things like that. So thinking about those two perspectives, and as a gay man kind of navigating these worlds, kind of feeling like an outsider in all those conversations, I many times felt like I was a spy or something in these rooms. I was like, well, none of this really applies to me, but okay, cool. Like this is it's been interesting to kind of hear those things from my own perspective on the outside, kind of outside looking in, so to speak. So I just wanted to share those two very different kind of communities and how they approach sex.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just blown away by all of your experiences. My experience as it's actually funny, Nandini, you were talking about how you came here as an adult. I came here as a child, and I wasn't raised in Vietnam, right? I was raised in a foreign land, and our family we rarely talked about sex, but we talked about sexual assault all the time. And I don't think that's necessarily a product of the culture. I think it's more of a product of my parents seeing that they're raising two daughters. They know that they're in a different place. They're away from loved ones. They're away from communities that they can trust. Growing up, my mom always told me, like, if someone kidnaps you here, it's not like when they kidnap you in Vietnam. In Vietnam, they'll just take you and ask for like and hold you hostage and ask for money. But here they're going to rape you and then chop you up and then throw you in the ditch. And that's like one of my earliest memories was just my mom very much associating sex with violence, right? And that was all pretty much the conversations around sex that we ever really get. It's making sure that you are protecting yourself, making sure that nobody's touching you. I have an aunt who, whenever I actually see her for like reunions and stuff, she would always ask me without fail, is anyone touching you? Is anyone doing something that you don't want to happen? When I moved here, I actually called her and caught up with her, and she said, okay, you're living in a ground level apartment, can you prop the couch onto the door to make sure that at night no one can go in? And it's just these conversations were very much ingrained within me as a child, to be very wary, particularly wary of men, because that's usually like when they say, the people who are touching you, it's almost always like, have there been boys who have been touching you? So that's been ingrained in me. But I think in some respects, it was helpful in the sense that I never felt as much of the shame that's around sex and sexuality. It's always, they're always asking like, did anyone do this to you? Not necessarily, did you do this to yourself, or did you put yourself in a position where someone can take advantage of you? So I think because they omitted that piece of it, I actually grew up fairly sexually healthy because I didn't feel like an immense sense of shame around my sexuality. And I didn't learn about sexuality from my parents, and I didn't learn it from my family, but I managed to learn it from my peers, from my teachers, and I didn't have like any ingrained sense of like fear or shame around it in terms of myself. I had a lot of fear of men, but not about me.
I think that perfectly kind of ties into our next question. I love that, that intention to protect didn't have to include like the victim blaming or like, why did you put yourself in that position? That's so cool that, that because of, I guess, like the way that it was talked about within your family and within your experience, that you didn't have to grow up thinking that it was like, it would have been your fault if you had put yourself in that position. I think that's really cool. And I mean, it speaks to like how individual and how separate our like experiences can be. So kind of, we talked a lot about kind of these like larger themes that we saw within culture, within religion, about the way that sex was or wasn't talked about, or sexual assault was talked about. I wonder if there are like specific messages about, again, totally tying into what Lynn said, if there are specific messages that you got about sex or sexual assault that either supported what you know about rape culture or worked to dismantle it. Kind of a complicated question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I can go. I would say the rape culture didn't come from a vacuum. It is the product of harmful patriarchal norms where victims are always blamed, and gender discrimination, gender abuse, these kind of things are reality. So in many South Asian countries, we talk about eve teasing, and it is actually sexual harassment, and oftentimes it ends up in acid attack or brutal gang rape or even murder. But when we call it eve teasing, it is it is undermining the seriousness of the issue. And it's not just, and many times we don't realize that it's not just teasing, it's stalking, it's assault, it's harassment. But girls are always told that cover your body, don't go out alone, don't do this thing, don't do that. And it's like it's their responsibility to protect themselves. And it's like indirectly we were told that if we are raped, then it is our fault. And South Asian filmmakers should also be held accountable for rape culture. Their content is consumed across South Asia and thus carries significant influence. Much of the content produced in Bollywood movies promote patriarchal narratives and normalize the hyper objectification of women by portraying women as lustful objects, catered to the male gaze. And yes, we are seeing some progress in India and other South Asian countries in terms of gender parity, in terms of implementing laws, but a long way to go. I would say that during 2012 Nirvaya rape case, I don't know how many of you know about that rape case. A medical student was brutally raped in a bus, and it happened. It's a horrific incident. And then she was thrown on the street, bleeding profusely, no, without any clothes on. But at that time, there was an outpour of protest on the street in India. But then what? Then still we are seeing every day, gang rape and rapes, this sexual assault, these kind of things are happening. And there are tons of research that proves still women's place in India is not safe. And not only India, I can talk about even Bangladesh, even Pakistan, the South Asian countries. Women's place, I wouldn't say that it's a safe place for women to be there. Yeah, I can what was your question, that what we learned about in our culture about sex and sexuality that supported the rape culture. And it is like that that's what we learned, that it is women's job, girls job, to protect their chastity. It is their women's family honor is tied to women's vagina. I don't know how, what, like, so it's honor killing is happening if the girl is having any sexual relationship before she gets married, then her family is killing her. So that kind of news or incidents give us a big picture that so much gender abuse and gender discrimination is creating or instigating rape culture, where women are seen as objects, and male can do, are powerful. They have power, they can do anything with women's body.
To bounce off of that, I think when I think about what I saw in my own community and family growing up, and thinking about oftentimes we mimic what was modeled for us, right? And I think about the dynamic specifically with sexual assault towards women by men. I think in the Latino culture and in so many other cultures around the world that are more kind of communal, more of a sense of loyalty to your family. You kind of have to put the greater good above your own, and many times if you see in families, specifically women. Kind of they put their family first, right? So even if their husband or their male partner is being abusive or is being abusive, they oftentimes will say, well, I'm gonna stick it out for my children so that they can have the stability, and and so on and so forth. And they might kind of face more of the more literal sexual assault or everything, any kind of abuse beyond that. And I think about how many young girls, and I see how many young girls see that, and then they end up kind of mimicking that because that's what they grew up with, right? And that, that could be something as it could be sexual assault, or it could just be, like I mentioned, other forms of abuse. But that's modeled there, right? And again, as a boy growing up, fortunately I did not see those kind of dynamics in my own family. I'm very with my own parents, I'm very fortunate in that sense. But it was not too far from home that I did see that. And thinking about what was modeled for me, like again, I'm not a heterosexual guy, so it was a little bit different. But I do think that I do see so many people in my community and family that kind of fall into those same patterns because of this idea of, like, it's not about your bodily autonomy. Your autonomy takes a backseat to the family is good, the community is good, right? All those things come first, and your autonomy is last. So whether that's, it's kind of putting yourself last in, from everything to who eats last at the dinner table, all the way through what right do you have to your own body in a sexual way, right? And again, we mimic what's modeled for us, and we have to actively break those chains if we want to change it. And that active part, I think, is the key there.
Yeah, I just have two things to add. Nandini, so interesting that you brought up the 2012 case. I was actually a freshman in college, well, a sophomore in college at that time, and that case happened shortly after the Steubenville rape case in Steubenville, Ohio, and both of them really made an impact on me. I actually, the very next semester, went to my campus's sexual assault prevention office and asked to volunteer there because both of those cases together made such an impact on me, and it was one of those like two 1-2 punches that like caused me to enter this work. So it's really interesting how like everything is interconnected, and how something happening in a place far away can actually have like impact for years to come. I think in terms of my family, I've already spoken a little bit about how like their overprotectiveness in certain ways was good in terms of like downplaying a lot of the traditional like victim blaming you would see in rape culture. But I also think that it was extremely unhealthy in the sense that it demonized men for a long time in my life. And I think even now, like I've been with my partner for 3 years, and my mom still, whenever she talks about him, she always asks like, oh, I hope you're not having sex. I hope he's not taking advantage of you in that way. I hope he's not, it's always about like, there's still that power dynamic that comes into the conversation. There's always a sense that you would lose if you were to have sex with this person. It doesn't mean that they're assaulting you, but there's always a winner or a loser when it comes to sex and sexuality. And I also think it's just so unhealthy to demonize men. It's very much a part of rape culture to see men as monsters, and to see assailants as monsters. But typically we would see those assailants in rape culture as men. And that it perpetuates this cycle of like, oh, you can't have control over yourself. You have to protect yourself from monsters, and that these people are not people. And it's all a mixed bag of terrible things that reinforce each other.
And also, in our culture, sometimes we see that many people don't understand that male children can face sexual abuse. So they don't prepare male children to avoid sexual abuse. It is automatically assumed that only women will get raped. When they will face sexual assault. And as you were saying, Lynn, that many South Asian parents also tell their daughters how to be safe. Don't go out, don't do this, don't cover your body, don't wear provocative dress, don't do something stupid. So they always teach their daughters how to protect themselves from perpetrators, but they hardly they teach their boys that how to protect themselves from sexual predators. So that is a I think it's a big thing. And when I was growing up, it was huge. But now, even now, I can see that South Asian parents sometimes they don't teach their boys how to be, how to care, what is a bad touch, good touch, what is, how to protect themselves, how to report if they face any uncomfortable situation. So that I think is lacking in our community.
something that was in kind of an interesting perspective to have seen during my time in the evangelical church was really the way that we as men were talked to about what our sexuality was and what our sexual drive was. It was a lot of language around men are, and it was language like men are naturally more sexual than women. Men think about sex way more than women. And it was just this idea that was ingrained in us that as a man, you have a really strong sex drive and you need to tame it. That's really what the narrative was that we were taught, you know? And I think about how evident that becomes then in that, you know, if this is reinforced, this sex drive is something that I need to tame because I'm so naturally, I have this sexual drive that's out of control. That's going to really shape a lot of your actions. And I think back to, you know, even as recently as in the last couple of months, that the shooting at that spa in Atlanta, and apart from the racial dynamics of that, which obviously was a big part of that, the shooter said, you know, it was, you know, I needed to get rid of that temptation, right? I was tempted by these women, so I needed to get rid of the temptation. And he was somebody who grew up in that church. And of course, not everybody who's evangelical grows up and does that. But that understanding of like, this is a temptation, I can't control myself. And of course, then you're going to start to see that there's going to be these, I messed up, so I'm going to now, you know, do this thing to a woman or to whoever it is that I'm attracted to. So that upbringing, that so many of, I mean, there's so many people that grow up with those dynamics in this country and in the world, that men are taught is that, you know, you're taught that this is you are innately a very highly sexual being that you need to tame. And that clearly we're seeing what the results of that are in our societies, right?
Thank you for talking about these like very specific messages, or like the language that was used around sex, and like exactly how that ties into rape culture. Because I feel like sometimes we use like larger concepts like patriarchy or like gender roles, and like we don't get into the specifics of like what that might look like in our everyday life and our family and the things that we say. So I really appreciate all of you like going into this. Wow. So there's so much that we've talked about already, and we've like touched on certain pieces on like of these larger ideas and taboos, and these more specific messages around sex, around gender that we hear that tie into rape culture. What do you feel needs to change about the way that we learn about sex in order to prevent sexual assault?
Lot of things. We must start sex education very early. What I personally believe, we must start sex education very early. Children need to learn about concepts of consent, including respecting boundaries, asking before touching, and who to turn to if they feel uncomfortable. It is too late when they go to high school or college. We need and we if we start early, they will understand it more clearly. And when they are going to college, they are in high school or college, is too late. And we need right policy to bring the change, and also the patriarchal culture that normalizes sexual assault needs to abolish. And so many things. I mean, abstinence only sex education programs can lead to shame and confusion surrounding sex, which puts youth at higher risk of assault and makes it less likely they will report such abuse. And we don't need to teach children. Some parents, maybe they will be panic that, oh, do you need to we don't need to teach children sex, and rape, etc. No, we don't need to teach children how one can have sex, or the different ways of have sex, or a definition of rape, but we can teach them the concept of boundaries, power imbalance in relationship, good touch, bad touch. And when they feel, they should know that their rights and their they have every right to protect their body, and they have every right to um, to report if they have any uncomfortableness, any times they feel that it is not right. So we need to do, I think we need to raise awareness. We need to talk a lot about this issue, inside families, within communities, like the way you are doing this panel discussion. I don't know how many community members are listening to this, but as you said that you will post this recording to your channels, and hopefully at least handful of parents are listening to it, and they share this their this discussion with others. I think it will have a ripple effect, and people will understand that, it is not important to only teach our children how to uh, uh, protect themselves from not being raped, but also um, why is that important, also what is toxic relationship, how to identify and avoid toxic sexual relationship, and how to have a healthy sexual relationship. They should know about their own body and their desire. I don't know whether I uh, gave you the right answer, or my questions and
gave us
my
so
answers are
much.
diverted.
You gave us so much. Thank you. There's so much about early consent education, learning about boundaries, healthy relationships, policy change to bring that education in, and how like talking to your kids about sex doesn't have to be, you don't talk about the logistics of it. You don't talk about how to do it, but you talk about your how to say yes, how to say no, how to communicate that, what is not okay, and about your autonomy. So, I mean, it's perfect. Everything we could ask for. Um, anyone want to elaborate?
Yeah, I can go. I don't have like any specific, like huge kind of idea around prevention. But I think when I was listening to the question, I was thinking about it. I just think it'd be better if sex was boring. Like when we talk, well, not boring, but like it's not anything like that we put on a pedestal. It's not something we should be scared of. It's not something that we should, like idolize. I think there's a lot of focus on sex, in a way that like there shouldn't be that much focus on sex. I mean, if sex is enjoyable, if sex is something you like, it's just one of the many, many things in your life that you can enjoy and like. And it there's something we special, like we treat sex so special in a way that is really, really strange. And I think that the less we can do that, the better. And I also think that the more sex positive like friends children can have, the better. Like if you're able to actually have these conversations in your friend group, I think that would go such a long way in helping with your development. So just on a personal note, my current partner is my first sexual partner. I never, as I was growing up, I didn't really like feel pressured or inclined to actually have sex early. I know a lot of my friends across genders who felt pressured to have sex early or to not have sex or all of that stuff. And I never felt that pressure. I didn't give that pressure to myself. And even though my current partner has been my only sexual partner, we always laugh about it, but I'm much more sexually healthy than he is. He grew up in a conservative Christian home, rebelled against that, had, like a series of sexual partners, and still feels like he's out of touch with his sexuality. There's a lot of uncertainty there for him. And it's really, really interesting that healthy sexuality is not necessarily about sex. It's about how you engage with other people, how you see yourself. And ultimately like that, I feel like the communal aspect of talking about sex should be something that should be encouraged with our children.
I would just very quickly add, as I mentioned, I teach high school, and it's really cool to see the young people, which makes me feel a lot older saying that, but the like high school teenage, there's so many things that when I was in high school I would never have talked about. Mental health, for example. never, if you had asked me how's your mental health, I would have looked at you with a blank stare when I was 16, right? But now you ask a 16-year-old, they will pretty much answer. They know what we're talking about. So by saying that, I mean that I think nor like naming sexual assault, naming rape culture as up there, like just like they know that you're not cyberbullying, just like they know like you're not supposed to be mean, like these things that are just so common for say these are things that we do not do, adding that to that in a very open way, versus something that hides in the shadows, right? Versus something that is like not talked about at all. I think when it's brought to light and when it's named as such, then it's something that can be talked about more openly. But as long as it stays in the shadows, as long as it's something that's considered taboo, then it's going to continue to happen without any sort of movement forward, right?
I think those are great points, both about how, sex should be normal enough to be talked about within our communities, and also that like sex isn't the only place where boundaries and consent exist. Like we can establish a precedent for respect for consent outside of that without centering everything around sex. So that's like, it's a really interesting like way to like think about this question as well, where it's like, if we prevent sexual assault by decentering like the importance or like the fear, like the glamorization of sex. So
You're on mute, Aveni.
I know we have like maybe like an hour and 15 minutes on top of that. Unfortunately, we couldn't have one of our panelists come. So I think our discussion will end up running shorter, and hopefully we can make some time after the recording is done to hear from our participants as well. But just closing comments, since we've already heard so much today. Why do you think it's important, again, just like a general, like really like summary, we've talked about so much today. Why do you think it's important to learn about sex when it comes to sexual assault? Like, just why is it important? Simply.
If we have same shame and taboo around our own body parts, desire and sexual pleasure and sexuality, if we have misconception about healthy sexual behavior, then we won't be able to identify and avoid toxic sexual behavior. And to understand what is toxic sexual relationship is, we need to know first about what is respectful and healthy sexual relationship. And if we don't have training, education on this subject, then we won't be able to prevent sexual assault. What Rod said, that we have to make it a normal conversation. We have to have education. We have to continuous, in starting from even elementary school. We don't need to wait till people are going to college. We don't need to wait till they are in high school and they're about to go to college. We can start from elementary school, and we have to start training and education how to, so that they can know that it is okay to know about their own body. It is okay to be protective about their own body. It is okay to report anything that is they feel uncomfortable, kids feel uncomfortable. So I think if we don't know, if our children, especially if they don't know, they don't learn, they don't have proper education and training about sex, then it will be difficult for them to understand sexual abuse and to report that abuse. And again, to training on sex, on education on sex, I don't mean that how to have sex. I'm not asking people to teach your children how to have sex. I am just teaching that um, you know important education around that topic.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I feel like this is a staring game. Zoom makes everything so awkward. I guess the question was about why was it important to learn about sex when it comes to preventing sexual assault? Well, I mean that's the mechanism, right, for which people assert their power over others. I remember when I first started learning about sexual assault prevention, something that was always told, and it's very much a mantra in this field, is that sexual assault isn't about sex, it's about power. And something about that like never quite sat well with me, because you can't discount the mechanism, right? You have to talk about the mechanism and why that is the mechanism of choice. And I think it's important to have those conversations. Otherwise, you're not going to really be able to address like the issue at hand. Sex is a way, you can say that people assault others because they feel powerless or they're trying to gain power, but no matter how you slice it, the mechanism that they choose to do that is through sex, and education about sex is absolutely necessary in order to address the issue.
I would just add the normalization and the bringing it to light. Just like with so many things we've seen progress on in our society in the last, however many years, it's because they've been talked about openly. It's because they've been normalized. So I think doing that will allow us to really have a productive conversation about how to actually stop it, how to end it. It needs to be normalized.
And I can add that, misconception and misinformation can make people, especially children, confused. Because the first time I learned about sex when I was in middle school, and I came to know about how babies are born, and indirectly about sex. So that time when I was in middle school. And so basically, it was the textbook theory, and we discussed among friends who are all middle school students, and think about it, their level of knowledge we had at that time. And we used to share the information like sex is dirty, it's to be done in the darkness at night, of night, under the sheets where no one is watching, and after you get married you can only have sex, and then you have sex because you need to produce baby. And it's important that it's not important whether you enjoy or not, that discussion was completely absent, that the desire, pleasure, anything related to sex was absolutely absent. It was only focused on this is the dirty part, but you have to have it because you have to make babies, and you have to prove yourself that you are a good wife, and you are it's kind of the who are sharing and teaching each other. We are sharing and teaching our knowledge and experience, and not experience um, whatever it is, I mean information, with all of them, are all of us are middle schoolers. We didn't have any training, any education on this subject. Even when I was in high school, I used to watch a lot of Bollywood movies, and that was my sex education. Because in school there is no sex education. And what is the sex education Bollywood movies are providing? That hero and heroine, they hold hands, they hug, they kiss, on the necks or hair, not even on lips, and then they go into under the sheet, or they close the bedroom door, and the next day, next scene is the girl is coming out of the door and she is pregnant. If that girl is married, then it's very happy news, she is a very good daughter-in-law or whatever. But if that girl is not married, then it's her family, and that girl is facing tremendous brutal social ostracism. So this kind of message, this kind of, this is, if this is the education, sex education I was getting when I was in school, then it is a scary thing. Then I'm getting the message that I shouldn't have sex before I get married. And my chastity, my it is very important, my virginity, my chastity, to keep family name intact, to to give my family prestige, or you know and unmarried girls shouldn't even think or talk about sex, forget about having sex. And it's like this kind of education is it's dangerous. We didn't know, and also we learned that sex can happen only between men and women, because that was the seen most Bollywood movies at that time. They were portraying, projecting. After I got married, I learned that the purpose of sex can be pleasure. My husband was raised in a Western country, and he introduced me the notion of consent, open communication around sex. It's both partners' responsibility to pay attention to each other's needs and explore. Uh, but when I was growing up, I had no such education, and it was, now I'm thinking it's kind of dangerous. It's not healthy. It's not, because I'm thankful that my husband, I had a loving, caring partner when I got married. But what if he was an abusive partner? Then I don't know. I don't know whether I could have identified it's a abuse as a normal behavior. I don't know whether I could have uh, talked about it to anyone. So I'm blessed that it didn't happen with me. Men, but probably many women, they are going through this kind of problem. They are going to even marital rape, but they don't know that if they can talk about it or not, because sometimes they feel that it's a cultural training that women should obey their male partners. Um, so this is problematic, and we must talk about it. We must do something, uh, and we must start very early.
Thank you. There was so much said by all of our panelists, um, about sex, learning about sex as being necessary to be able to identify whether a sexual relationship is healthy or not, to be able to understand like why power is even expressed that way, to be able to understand like why it's normalized. So thank you for that. Um, Thank you so much to our panelists. That is all of our questions. If our panelists would like to make some time to open themselves up for questions, I know we have a couple in the chat box. Um, we'll try to field those and see what we can do, and eventually stop recording, which I'll let everyone know when that's happening. And then if participants feel comfortable sharing their stories then or their experiences, we'd love to hear from some brave folks. So we got an interesting and
Avani, you're muted.
how long has it been that I've been using Zoom and still can't grasp this? Okay.
You're muted again. It's okay.
I was gonna say that we have an interesting question in the chat box on the difference between abuse, like sexual abuse of power versus other abuses of power. And I guess the messages behind both, or the difference in the messages behind both. Let me know if I'm describing this question properly. I want to make sure that we get to talk about it in a way that's enlightening. Yeah, if you'd like to clarify in the chat box, or we can unmute you, and if you feel comfortable with that. Okay, all right, I will unmute you then, and we'd love to hear from you. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, so you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So what I'm trying to understand is this question, and Lynn was pointing at this earlier, which is the use of sex as an abuse of power in the form of rape. Is that somehow fundamentally different? I mean, of course, it's in terms of abuse, but in terms of how it's being taught not to be done, is that different than any other time we're teaching someone not to misuse power? Is it fundamentally a sexual conversation, or are we really just talking about whether people abuse power over others for whatever ends they want to use the power over others? The reason I ask is because it determines, if you're trying to influence the problem, whether the answer is to be having all sorts of conversations about sexuality. And I'm not clear if those really address it, right? Do you tell a rapist, hey, here's how healthy sex works, and they're going to go, oh, okay, then I'm not going to force it on someone. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that's necessarily the case. So that's what I'm trying to understand. I see some nodding heads, so I think you're getting something out of what I'm asking. So thanks.
Yeah, I can go first on this. This is something that I also as an advocate really struggle with. I think there's a lot of focus on survivorship and the people who are impacted by sexual violence in this work, and there's less focus on the people who are perpetrating the violence. And this was something that I struggled with when I was working as an advocate on how come we're not talking about as much the people who are actually assaulting others. And sometimes when we have conversations around prevention, my mind kind of goes back to that, right? Is talking about sexuality and talking about healthy sexual behaviors really going to be effective in deterring these behaviors from people who may choose to exert their power this way regardless? I think something that has kind of worked for me in terms of thinking about it is it's just as important, if even if you don't believe necessarily, and sometimes I find myself in that position too, where you don't necessarily believe that teaching sexuality is necessarily going to stop sexual assault. What I do believe is that there is a certain level of hesitancy when it comes to doing a behavior if you feel like the community is against you, if you feel like this type of problem is very explicitly and openly talked about as an issue, and that you're not necessarily encouraged to do it. And I think that type of motivation and incentive, that type of social incentive, is very much lacking in terms of sexual assault compared to some of the other abuses of power. And then there's also, it's coupled with the fact that there's so much shame and so much stigma on the receiving end of sexual assault, and it makes it so it creates an environment where you're not necessarily disincentivized from doing it, and the person who's on the receiving end of the assault is very much disincentivized from talking about it. So it very much creates an encouraging environment for that type of behavior. And as much as I do struggle sometimes thinking in terms of where are we focusing prevention? Are we really addressing the problem? I think I go back to thinking about how do we build a community and how do we build a village to actually talk about and address this problem? And I think part of that is sexual education, because we need to make sure we're destigmatizing that piece of it to take the power out of the mechanism. And yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
I want to just add, I think, as with every sort of act of violence, sometimes people do it without realizing it might be that, right? And obviously there's it's a whole spectrum of things, but I remember I was with a family member one time. I think I was in college, and we were driving in the car, we were by the beach, and there was a girl walking by, and he called her out the window, and I was like, what? What are you doing? Why would you do that? And he was like, what? And I was, I told him, how do you think she feels, with that? And he's like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't think about it. I never thought about that. Right. And I realized, as I'm sure I'm sure she was very uncomfortable. In his brain, he was just doing what he did, right? So there's that aspect of like, are there people that are still going to do these actions in spite of knowing it's an act of power? Yes, that's still going to happen, just like with every sort of act of violence, right? That still happens. But like what Lynn, what you mentioned is that like, how do we like make it so that we understand this is not encouraged, this is in fact discouraged, this is not okay, this is not normal, you don't have to do this, this is how the other person feels, and kind of creating those conversations in a more public sense. Because that was very eye-opening to me, because in my brain I was like, I guess because of my perspective as, you know, a gay man, I guess I kind of hear both sides sometimes of things, you know, when it comes to like between, you know, straight men and straight women. But in that moment, I was like, he really didn't realize that that's a thing, and he's been doing that his whole life, I'm sure. So, and I don't know what's happened if he does that anymore. Hopefully not. But this was, you know, a really interesting, eye-opening moment.
Yeah, I kind of, agree with Lena and Rod both. And we need to create a community culture, a culture in our society where we will not, encourage victim blaming, and we will hold perpetrators accountable. And if children, they get that message from the very beginning, and they know how to develop skills to initiate and nurture strong, respectful, healthy relationship, whether it is sexual or otherwise, then I think we will be able to, um, create a different culture and community.
Hopefully we heard so much. Hopefully we answered pieces of what you were asking about. I also
Can I answer that? Should I answer that?
Yeah, go for it.
I just remembered I could talk. I was typing away madly. Thank you. No, I thought those were great. Those are great answers, and I think you addressed just what I was asking, which is, and I think what my takeaway is how there is some compartmentalization between, the difference between the extreme cases that you're not going to address, and then there's the category of cases where. I'm sorry, Rod, is it Rod? No. Yeah, okay, Rod was bringing up where there's a category of some ambiguity of what do people know that they're doing and or totally understand. And I was thinking that it is a bit like, as I thought about, where moral development comes from, it's generally understood that it comes through dialogue and thinking through scenarios. We develop ethics by thinking through scenarios. And if sex is a topic we don't talk about, you don't get that opportunity to think through those scenarios, right? So that's like, that is a spot I'm going, oh, that has a lot of value. And what was I going to say? The other thing, I forget the other thing. If I come back, I'll say it, but that was good.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks. Oh yeah, the other thing was the part that Lynn said, which is how you talk about influencing people, and they know psychologically that you generally don't influence people by telling them what to do. In fact, that in like political debate, you actually get what I think they call it the backfire effect, where they tend to dig into whatever their opinion is the more you try to tell them. But the thing that does influence people is what they perceive everyone else is doing, what the majority is doing, has a huge impact even without their knowledge. So Lynn nailed that one, where it's like, oh yeah, we can really shift that by having these conversations regularly where everybody has this understanding that, oh, that's just not done. That's not the way things are supposed to be done. And yes, there will be those outliers that are always going to break out of that. But if you carry a bigger bulk of the middle ground people, you can have a huge impact on the total number of disasters. Did I get that right, Lynn?
I credit that to my Asian background. A lot of collectivist shame.
It works though.
Do we have any other questions? If not, I'll stop recording. We'll leave some time to talk after that. Okay, I don't see anything popping up, so I'm going to stop recording.